The folding chairs in the church fellowship hall were still warm when I stepped outside for air. And that was when I saw the empty space where my truck had been parked since 6:30 that morning. Just gravel. Tire marks pressed into the dust, going one direction toward the road. I did not say anything at first. I stood there in my one good suit, the same one I wore to Dorothy's retirement dinner 11 years ago, and I looked at that empty patch of gravel, the way a man looks at a missing tooth, with his tongue not quite believing the shape of the gap. A folded piece of paper sat on the curb where the front bumper used to be, weighted down by a rock somebody had picked up off the ground. I bent and got it. My knees complained. They had been complaining for years, but today they complained louder, like everything else in me had decided this was the day to stop pretending. The note wasn't in anybody's handwriting I recognized. Sorry thought the truck was clear to drive off the lot. Guy who sold it to me said the title was all sorted. If there's a problem, my number's on the back A phone number, written in pencil, smudged at the edges like it had been written fast in a parking lot by somebody who didn't expect to need it twice. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it back along its original creases and put it in my breast pocket, next to the funeral program with Dorothy's photograph on the front, the one where she's squinting into sunlight on the porch. Laughing at something I said behind the camera, something I don't even remember anymore. I did not run inside shouting. I did not slam my hand on anything. I stood in that gravel lot for a long moment, the November wind moving through the bare maples along the church fence, and I thought about Dorothy's voice, calm as creek water, saying the things she used to say whenever the children pushed too hard on something, and I wanted to push back twice as hard. Let them finish, Roy. The truth doesn't rush. I had heard those words for 40 years as Patience, standing in that empty parking space. On the day I buried her, I heard them differently for the first time. Like she was already 2 steps ahead of whatever this was. Like she'd left the porch light on for a problem she knew was coming, long before I did. Inside, through the propped fellowship hall door, I could hear the murmur of 200 people eating ham sandwiches and saying my wife's name in the past tense. Karen's laugh cut through once, too bright, the laugh she does when she's managing something. Managing people. Managing me lately, though she'd never put it that way out loud. I did not go back inside right away. I walked to the edge of the lot instead, past the hedge Dorothy planted the year Brent was born, and I looked down Route 9 toward the bend where the truck tracks disappeared. 40 years I drove that road, delivering mail to every farmhouse and trailer and brick ranch between here and the county line. I knew every pothole in it by feel. I knew, somehow, without being told, that the truck wasn't going to be easy to find, and that whoever sold it hadn't expected me to come looking before sundown. Dorothy's notebook was in that glove box, had been for 20 years. Every oil change, every mile, every name of every soul who ever won the VFW raffle truck written in her careful schoolteacher hand, the same hand that used to write, Roy. Don't forget Dentist Tuesday, on the kitchen calendar in red ink. I needed that notebook back more than I needed the truck. I put the rock back exactly where I'd found it, like that mattered, like setting a stone down gently, was a thing a man could still control on a day when nothing else was. Behind me, the fellowship hall door opened. Karen's voice, calling my name across the lot, asking where I'd gone, asking if I was all right, the particular brightness in it that meant she was checking a box rather than asking a question. I'm fine, I said, and walked back toward the warm light and the ham sandwiches, and my dead wife's photograph propped on an easel by the guest book. And I did not mention the empty gravel, or the folded note in my breast pocket, or the slow, cold certainty settling into my chest that my son had done something today he could not undo by sundown. I would learn, before the week was out, that I was right about that. I would also learn that Dorothy had known it was coming before either of us did, and that she had not left me unprepared. She had simply trusted me to be patient long enough to find what she'd already put in place. I just didn't know yet where to look. 72 hours before the funeral, Dorothy was still alive, and the kitchen still smelled like the chicken broth she'd been sipping for 3 days. Because it was the only thing that didn't turn her stomach. I remember the light in that kitchen the way a man remembers the weather on the worst days of his life, flat and gray, coming in low through the window over the sink, falling across the tin recipe box that never left the counter in 38 years. Dorothy was in the hospital bed we'd set up in the front room by then, the hospice nurse coming twice a day, and I was the one standing at the stove, because somebody had to, even though neither of us was going to eat much of anything. Brent came by that Tuesday evening. I heard his truck not mine, a newer one he was still paying on, pull into the drive too fast, gravel popping under the tires the way it does when a man's mind is somewhere ahead of his hands. He didn't go in to see his mother first. He came to find me in the kitchen. "Dad, got a second?" I had nothing but seconds those days. I turned the burner down and gave him my attention, the way I'd given it to him for 41 years, the way a father does even when some old quiet part of him has started keeping score. "I need to talk to you about something, money thing." "Nothing serious, just—" He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since he was 11 years old and lying about a broken window. "The towing business. It's not really working out the way I thought." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it, though something in me, some small cold gear, turned over once quietly, the way it does when a man senses a request coming before it arrives. "I might need to borrow against something, just for a little while. I've got people I owe, and I don't want it getting—" He stopped himself. "I don't want Mom worrying about it. Not now." I told him we'd talk after, once things had settled, and he nodded like that was good enough, though I could see in his face it wasn't. Not really. He went in to sit with his mother for 11 minutes, I know, because I watched the clock on the stove without meaning to, and then he left, his truck spitting gravel again on the way out. Karen called that same night, her voice doing the thing it does when she's already decided something, and is informing you of it rather than asking. "Dad, once the service is behind us, I think we need to start thinking seriously about downsizing. The house is too much for you alone. I can come by that week and we can go through things." "There's no rush, Karen." "There's always a rush, Dad. That's the thing nobody tells you. If we don't get ahead of it, it just sits there getting harder." I didn't argue. I was learning in those days that arguing took fuel I didn't have to spare, and every ounce of it needed to go toward the woman, dying 8 feet from where I stood holding the phone. Dorothy heard the tail end of that call. She had a way of hearing things even when her body was failing her in every other direction, like her ears had decided to outlast the rest of her out of spite. "Karen wants to clean us out already," she said when I came back to sit beside her, and there was no anger in it, just a flat, tired knowing. "She means well." "She means fast," Dorothy said. "There's a difference, Roy, and you've never been able to tell them apart, even after 46 years of marriage to a woman who could." I laughed because it was true, and because laughing was easier than the alternative, and Dorothy reached over and took my hand with the strength she had left, which wasn't much, but it was enough to make her point. "I need you to do something for me," she said, "and I need you not to ask me 100 questions about it, because I don't have the breath for 100 questions." "All right. There's a folder in my sewing cabinet. Bottom drawer. I want you to leave it exactly where it is until you need it. You'll know when you need it." "Dorothy, I'm not asking you to understand it right now, Roy. I'm asking you to trust me the way you always have. That's all I've ever asked you for, and you've never once let me down on that score, so don't start tonight. I didn't open that drawer. I want that understood. I am not a man who goes digging through his wife's private things, even on her deathbed, even when she half invites me to. I let it be the way she asked." What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that the folder in that drawer wasn't the only thing she'd quietly arranged. 8 years earlier, after a scare with my blood pressure that put me in the Cedar Fork Clinic overnight, Dorothy had driven herself to the county clerk's office without telling me and done something to the truck's paperwork. I remembered the blood pressure scare. I did not remember any trip to the clerk's office. She'd never mentioned it, and I'd never asked, because in 46 years of marriage there were 100 small errands Dorothy ran without reporting them to me, and I had no reason to think that one was different from picking up stamps or dropping off library books. She also went to see Lou Fenimore that same season, though I wouldn't learn that part for almost a week. What I knew, sitting beside her hospital bed with the kitchen smelling of broth neither of us would finish, was only this. My wife was dying, my son needed money he didn't want his mother to know about, and my daughter wanted the house emptied before the funeral flowers had finished wilting. I did not know yet how those three facts would collide. Dorothy died 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, with the window cracked the way she liked it even in November. And the last thing she said to me clear, before the medication pulled her back under, for the final time, was the same thing she'd been saying for years. The thing I'd never once understood as a plan rather than a comfort. "Let them finish, Roy. The truth doesn't rush." I held her hand until it went quiet in mine, and outside that window, somewhere down Route 9, a truck I hadn't yet learned to worry about sat parked in our drive, its glove-box notebook recording nothing yet but ordinary mileage, waiting for a story none of us had written. The funeral was on a Saturday, and by 10 that morning the church lot was full of cars. I half-recognized neighbors, men from the old postal route who'd retired around the same years I had, 2 women from Dorothy's quilting circle wearing matching navy coats like they'd planned it without meaning to. I stood at the door of the sanctuary greeting people because that's what a man does, even when the inside of his chest feels like a house with the furniture removed. Hand after hand, shoulder after shoulder. "She was a wonderful woman, Roy. I'm so sorry." "She'll be missed," I said. "Thank you." So many times the words stopped meaning anything, which I think is the point. You say them until they're just sounds, and the sounds carry you through the part where your knees might otherwise give out. Brent arrived late, which didn't surprise me, but he arrived already on his phone, which did. He stood near the parking lot for a long moment before coming in, his back half-turned, his voice low and clipped in a way I recognized from when he was a teenager hiding a conversation he didn't want overheard. I caught 4 words of it as I held the door for the Pruitt family. "Cash today I need." Then he saw me watching and ended the call fast, sliding the phone into his jacket pocket like it had burned him. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Work stuff. Sorry. Dad. Bad timing." He hugged me quick and stiff, the way men in our family hug, and went inside to find his seat. The service itself I remember in pieces, the way you remember a fever. Pastor Eli's voice rising and falling, the choir doing the hymn Dorothy requested years ago without ever telling me why she'd chosen it, my own hand gripping the program with her photograph on the front hard enough to crease the corner. I do not remember standing up. I do not remember sitting down. I remember Karen beside me, her hand occasionally finding mine, squeezing it in the particular rhythm of someone managing her own grief by managing the appearance of mine. After, at the reception in the fellowship hall, I was pulled into conversation after conversation, old Mrs. Tillman from 2 farms over, telling me a story about Dorothy and a sewing circle disagreement from 1987 that I'd somehow never heard, Lou Fenimore gripping my shoulder hard, saying less than anyone else and meaning more by saying it. The new young pastor's wife, bringing me a plate of food I had no intention of eating. It was during one of those conversations, Mrs. Tillman, mid-sentence about a quilt pattern, that I saw Brent slip out the side door near the kitchen, the one that led to the gravel lot where the trucks were parked. I didn't think much of it. A man steps outside at his mother's funeral reception for all kinds of reasons. Air, a phone call he doesn't want overheard, a private minute to fall apart where nobody's watching. I didn't see him meet anyone in that lot. I didn't see the cash change hands, or the title get signed over with my name copied onto a bill of sale in handwriting that wasn't mine because Brent had learned to forge the particular slant of my signature back when he was 16 and needed permission slips signed for things I'd never have allowed. I have pieced together since then what I didn't witness. A man named Curtis Hale had answered an online listing 2 days earlier, 1998 F-150, runs strong, family selling due to circumstances, cash only, today preferred. Brent met him in that gravel lot during his mother's funeral reception, walked him through a 5-minute inspection, handed over keys and a signed bill of sale, and pocketed $4,000 in a manila envelope before walking back inside to eat a ham sandwich and accept condolences for a loss he was simultaneously profiting from. I did not know any of that yet. I only knew an hour later, standing outside in the cold November air, with a folded note in my hand and an empty patch of gravel out where my truck should have been, that something had happened while I was inside being told stories about quilting circles, and that my son had walked past me on his way back into that fellowship hall without a single sign on his face that anything at all was wrong. That was the thing that stayed with me longest in the days that followed. Not the truck, Not even the notebook, though God knows I worried over that notebook like a man worries a sore tooth with his tongue. It was Brent's face, calm, composed. A man who had just done something irreversible to his grieving father, walking back into a room full of mourners with a ham sandwich in his hand, and nothing in his expression to suggest the floor had just shifted under both of us. I went back inside that day and finished greeting people. I shook more hands. I said, "Thank you," more times. I let Karen squeeze my hand in her managing rhythm, and I did not say one word about the empty gravel lot because some old instinct in me, maybe Dorothy's instinct, worn into me after 46 years of marriage, told me that whatever had happened in that parking lot needed daylight and proof before it needed my anger. Let them finish. The truth doesn't rush. I would understand soon enough just how much truth there was left to find, starting with a glove box and a notebook and a buyer named Curtis Hale who had no idea yet that the truck he'd just bought came with paperwork far more complicated than the bill of sale folded in his glove compartment. I called the number on the folded note that evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table where Dorothy's chair sat empty across from mine, her reading glasses still folded on the placemat where she'd left them 3 weeks ago. A man answered on the second ring, Curtis Hale. He sounded young, maybe 35, and nervous the way decent people get nervous when they suspect they've stepped into something they didn't sign up for. "I bought it off a listing," he said. "Fella met me at a church parking lot, of all places. Said the family was selling because of circumstances." I didn't think to ask more than that. Figured a funeral, somebody needed quick cash, didn't want to pry. "You didn't get his name?" "Brent, didn't catch a last name. Title and bill of sale both had a Roy Calhoun on them, signed over clean. I figured that was you." I sat with that for a moment, my own name, signed by a hand that wasn't mine, on a piece of paper authorizing the sale of something I'd never agreed to sell. "Mr. Hale, I think there's been a misunderstanding. That truck wasn't his to sell." A long pause on the line. "I had paperwork, sir. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just bought what was offered to me." "I understand. I'm not blaming you." And I meant that Curtis Hale was a man who'd answered an ad in good faith and driven home with what he believed was a clean deal. The trouble wasn't his. "Did you happen to look through the cab?" There was a notebook in the glove box. Spiral blue cover. Belonged to my late wife. There was some stuff in there, yeah. Owner's manual, some receipts, a notebook. I left most of it, figured somebody'd want their personal things back, even if the truck wasn't staying in the family. Another pause. "Actually, sir, I already moved the truck along. Took it to a shop on Route 9 this morning for a pre-resale once over before I list it myself. Fenimore's, I think it was called." Something in my chest loosened just slightly, the first easing of pressure since I'd stood in that empty gravel lot. Lou Fenimore. Of all the shops in 3 counties, the truck had landed at the one place where a man who'd known Dorothy for 30 years would be the one running his hands over the engine. I didn't call Lou that night. I told myself it was because it was late, because I was tired in a way that went past my bones and into something underneath them. The truth was simpler than that. I wasn't ready yet to know what I'd find. I wanted one more night of not knowing, the way a man sometimes needs a single night between the wound and the looking at it. What I did instead was sit at the kitchen table and think back on the fragment I'd overheard between Karen and Brent 2 days after the funeral, when they thought I'd gone out to the mailbox and stayed out longer than I had. I'd come back in through the side door, quiet on the linoleum, and heard them in the front room. "It's handled," Brent was saying. "Got enough to cover what I owe. Nobody needs to know the details." "I don't want details," Karen said. "I want this house empty by spring. I want us done managing 2 lives instead of 1. I love Dad, Brent, but I can't keep doing this." "You won't have to. I told you, it's handled." I'd stood in the hallway with my hand on the doorframe, not breathing the way you don't breathe when you're trying not to be discovered in your own house, and then I'd backed out quietly and gone to sit on the porch steps in the cold until my heart slowed down enough to walk back in and pretend I'd only just returned from the mailbox. "It's handled." I turned that phrase over the way Dorothy used to turn over a stitch that wasn't lying right, checking it from every angle before deciding whether to rip it out and start again. Handled meant planned. Handled meant Brent hadn't panicked into a bad decision in a moment of grief-stricken weakness. He'd arranged it, timed it, walked into his mother's funeral reception already knowing what he intended to do in that parking lot before the first hymn was sung. That was the part that sat heaviest in me that night, heavier than the truck, heavier even than the notebook I hadn't yet recovered. Not that my son had sold something that wasn't his. Men do desperate things when they're frightened and cornered, and I'd raised Brent to believe, rightly or wrongly, that I would always forgive him eventually if he came to me honest. What sat heaviest was that he hadn't come to me at all. He'd looked at his mother's casket and calculated with a cold, clear head how many hours of distraction a funeral would buy him. I thought of Dorothy's voice again. Let them finish. The truth doesn't rush, I understood, sitting there at that empty table, that I still did not know the whole shape of what she'd meant by those words. I knew there was a folder in her sewing cabinet I hadn't opened. I knew there was a trip to the county clerk's office, 8 years back, that I'd never been told about. I knew Lou Fenimore had the truck on his lift that very night, with Dorothy's notebook somewhere inside the cab. I did not yet know that the title itself made the sale impossible from the moment Brent signed my forged name to it, that some legal mechanism Dorothy had quietly set in motion 8 years ago was already, even as I sat there, working in my favor whether anyone in my family understood it or not. I only knew that for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief sitting in my chest. I felt the particular patient cold of a man who has decided to wait not because he's weak, and not because he doesn't know what's been done to him, but because he's finally beginning to understand that somebody, a long time ago, already started building the road that would lead him back to what was his. I went to bed that night without calling Lou, but I set my alarm early, and before I turned off the lamp, I opened the bottom drawer of Dorothy's sewing cabinet for the first time since she'd asked me not to just to look at the folder, not to read it yet, just to confirm it was still there, waiting, the way she'd promised it would be. It was. A plain manila folder, slightly yellowed at the corners, with nothing written on the outside except in Dorothy's careful hand, 4 words that stopped my breath in my chest. For when you're ready, I closed the drawer. I was not ready yet, but for the first time since the funeral, I understood that I was getting closer. I drove Karen's loaner car to the county clerk's office. On Monday morning, the truck still absent from my drive like a missing front tooth, I kept running my tongue over. Beverly Atkins had worked the records counter for as long as I'd been delivering mail, which was to say longer than either of us cared to admit out loud. She'd known Dorothy since high school. When she saw me come through the door, her whole face softened in that particular way people's faces do when they're looking at a man freshly widowed, like grief is something visible on the skin. "Roy, I'm so sorry about Dorothy. She was one of the good ones. Thank you, Beverly. I need to ask you about something if you've got a minute." I told her about the truck. Not all of it, not the funeral parking lot, not the forged signature, not the fragment of conversation I'd overheard through my own hallway. Just the bones of it, that it had been sold without my knowledge, and that I needed to understand what the title actually said. Beverly typed something into her computer, frowned at the screen the way people do when something doesn't match what they expect, and then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Roy, this is interesting. You and Dorothy retitled this vehicle back in," she squinted, 2018. "There's a transfer on death beneficiary designation attached. Did you know about that?" I did not know about that. I told her so. It means the truck wasn't just titled to you, or to you and Dorothy jointly the regular way. Dorothy set it up so that if something happened to one of you, ownership would transfer automatically outside of probate, outside of any will, straight to a named beneficiary. It's not common, but it's not rare either. People do it with vehicles sometimes, same as bank accounts. "Who's the beneficiary?" Beverly turned to the screen slightly so I could see, though I still needed my reading glasses to make out the small print. It wasn't Brent's name. It wasn't Karen's either. Cedar Fork VFW Post 4471. I sat very still in that hard plastic chair across from Beverly's desk, the fluorescent light humming overhead, and felt something in my chest shift the way ground shifts before you understand a foundation has settled wrong beneath it. The VFW raffle. 20 years of donating the truck each fall as the Haul Anything grand prize. Dorothy keeping the records in that spiral notebook, the two of us standing at the post hall every October handing keys, to whichever family had won that year for a single weekend's use before the truck came back to us. I'd always thought of it as charity. A nice tradition. Something Dorothy enjoyed more than I fully understood, the bookkeeping of it, the relationships with the post commanders over the years. I hadn't understood it was also, quietly, a kind of promise she was making to the post, and maybe to herself, about where that truck would ultimately belong if she wasn't here to keep deciding things year by year. "Roy, I need to explain something else," Beverly said, her voice gentler now, the way it gets when she's about to tell somebody something that matters. A transfer on death designation means that the moment Dorothy passed, legal title to that truck passed directly to the VFW post, not to you alone, not to your son, to the post, automatically by operation of law. Whatever your son did selling it, signing papers, any of that, none of that document had legal authority behind it. He didn't have clear title to convey. Nobody did, except the post itself, until they choose to do something with it. So the sale is void. As far as the law is concerned, it never happened. Your son sold something he never owned a single share of. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside Beverly's window, a truck very much unlike mine rumbled past on the street, hauling lumber, and I watched it without really seeing it, my mind turning over what I'd just been told. Dorothy had not protected the truck for me. She had not protected it for Brent or Karen or any version of the family she might have worried would fight over it someday. She had protected it for 20 Octobers worth of raffle winners she'd never live to see again. For a post hall full of men like me, men who'd served, men who needed a truck for a weekend to haul a load of hay or move a sick relative's furniture or get a broken-down tractor to the shop, she had quietly made sure that no matter what happened to her, or to me, or to whatever came apart in our family afterward, that small yearly act of generosity would keep happening. Everything that matters is written down somewhere, Roy. People just don't think to look. I thanked Beverly, who printed me a copy of the title record before I left, the words, "Transfer on Death Beneficiary, Cedar Fork VFW, Post 4471, sitting there in plain black ink, unremarkable as a grocery list, and yet heavier in my hand than anything I'd carried since the funeral program with Dorothy's photograph. I did not call Brent on the drive home. I did not call Karen. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after days of fog, that I was not yet holding the whole truth, only the legal bones of it. I still didn't know where the truck physically was, beyond Lou's shop. I still hadn't opened the folder in Dorothy's sewing cabinet. I still didn't know what Brent owed, or to whom, or why he'd been so certain nobody would check the paperwork before the cash was already spent. But I understood, finally, the shape of what Dorothy had built without telling me. Not a trap for our children, she wasn't a woman who thought in those terms. A safeguard. A patient, quiet piece of architecture put in place 8 years before she needed it, designed to outlast her own voice and protect something she cared about, long after she could no longer explain why. I drove home past the church where we'd buried her 6 days earlier, past the gravel lot where the truck had once sat, and for the first time since that empty patch of ground had stopped my heart in my chest, I felt something other than loss settle into its place. I felt like a man who finally understood he wasn't navigating this alone. Dorothy had left the porch light on after all. I just hadn't known, until that morning in Beverly Atkins' office, that the light had been burning for 8 quiet years, waiting for me to need it. By Wednesday, Brent believed the matter was closed. I knew this because Karen told me so herself, over the phone, her voice carrying the particular relief of a woman who thinks the hardest part of a hard season has finally passed. Brent mentioned he handled some things with the truck, she said. Said it's sorted out. I think it's for the best, Dad, honestly. You weren't going to be driving long distances anyway, not at your age, and it's one less thing sitting in the driveway reminding you every day. I let that sit for a moment before answering. One less thing reminding me of what exactly? A pause on her end. Of everything. The accident scare. Mom, you know what I mean. I did know what she meant, and that was the part that stung worst, sitting in my kitchen with Dorothy's empty chair across from me. Karen had decided, somewhere in the privacy of her own mind, that grief was a kind of clutter to be managed, and that clearing it away quickly was a mercy rather than a wound. I appreciate you checking in, I told her, and that was all I gave her. Not confirmation, not confrontation, just enough to let the conversation end without either of us understanding we were standing on different sides of a fact she didn't yet know existed. I learned more of the shape of Brent's debt that same week, though not from Brent. I learned it the way small towns teach a man most things sideways, through people who don't realize what they're handing you. I ran into Pastor Eli's wife at the grocery store on Thursday, and in the gentle, looping way of small-town conversation, she mentioned that her brother-in-law, Dale Whitcomb, had been having some trouble collecting on a loan he'd made to a family member doing towing work. I didn't think much of it at the time, beyond the ordinary sympathy a man offers a stranger's financial trouble. It wasn't until later, piecing things together after the fact, that I understood Dale Whitcomb was Karen's husband's cousin, which made him, by the tangled arithmetic of small-town marriage, close enough to family that Brent's debt and Karen's own household were connected by a thread neither of them had noticed yet. Karen had spent the week defending a sale that was, in a roundabout way, paying back a debt owed to her own extended family, without having the faintest idea that was true. I did not go to either of my children with what I'd learned. Not the title designation, not Dale Whitcomb, not the folder still waiting in Dorothy's sewing cabinet, which I still had not opened, though I'd taken to standing in front of that cabinet some evenings, hand resting on the drawer pull, not quite ready. What I did instead was drive out to Fenimore Auto on Route 9 on a gray Thursday afternoon with rain threatening and find Lou bent over an engine that wasn't mine, his coveralls the same faded green they'd been for 30 years. He straightened up when he saw me, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and didn't say anything for a moment. Lou Fenimore was never a man who rushed into speech. We'd served together decades back in the same National Guard unit, and some men you learned to read through silence better than through words, and Lou was one of those men for me. "Roy, Lou, heard about Dorothy. I'm sorry, she was something else." "She was," I agreed, and let that sit between us the way it needed to. "You hear about the truck," he said. "It wasn't a question. I am." Lou nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already half expected. "Came through here Monday. Fella named Hale brought it in for a pre-sale check before he flips it." He paused, studying me. "I recognize that VIN the second I pulled the panel, Roy. Serviced that truck for 20 years. I'd know it blind. Did you look in the glove box?" "I did." Something passed across his face, careful and deliberate. "Roy, I'm not going to hand anything over to anybody but you. Not the buyer, not your boy, if he comes around asking. You understand me?" "I do." "I'm not in a position to talk about everything I know right now," Lou said, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on uneven ground. "But I will tell you this much, your truck isn't going anywhere until you and I have had a proper conversation, away from anybody else listening. There's more sitting in that glove box than a maintenance log, Roy, and some of it's not mine to explain. It's yours to find." I asked him when. "Buyer's coming back Saturday morning to finalize his resale paperwork. He's already got somebody lined up to buy it off him. Wants to flip it quick. I told him I needed the week to give it a proper inspection before I'd sign off on the condition report. That bought us some time." Lou looked at me steady. "I think you ought to be here Saturday, Roy. I think your boy and your girl ought to be here too, if you can manage it without telling them why." I understood, standing in that garage with the smell of motor oil and rain coming through the open bay door, that Lou was offering me something more than information. He was offering me a room. A place where the truth could arrive on its own schedule in front of the people who needed to see it arrive, rather than delivered privately where it could be argued away or smoothed over before it had the chance to land. I thought of Dorothy's voice again, the way I'd been thinking of it constantly since the funeral, like she was walking a half step behind me through every room I entered now. "Let them finish, Roy. The truth doesn't rush." They had finished. Brent believed his debt was paid and his secret was safe. Karen believed the house would soon be cleared and her burden lightened. Both of them were standing, without knowing it, at the edge of a discovery that had been waiting 8 quiet years to find its moment. I drove home that evening past the church again, past the gravel lot, past the hedge Dorothy planted the year Brent was born, and for the first time since I'd stood in that empty parking space with a folded note in my hand, I felt something close to readiness settle into my chest. Saturday, I decided. I would call them both myself, tell them I needed help with something at Fenimore's, give them no more reason for suspicion than that. And whatever Dorothy had left in that glove box, whatever Lou wasn't yet willing to say, out loud, I would finally let it speak for itself, in a room full of the people who most needed to hear it. I went home, and for the first time opened the drawer in Dorothy's sewing cabinet without hesitating. I did not read the folder that night. I only held it in my hands at the kitchen table, feeling its slight weight, the 4 words on the front. For when you're ready, catching the lamplight. I was ready now. I had been ready, I realized, since the moment Beverly Atkins turned her computer screen toward me and showed me a beneficiary I'd never expected. Saturday would tell the rest. Lou's shop smelled like coffee and motor oil that Saturday morning, the bay doors halfway open to a sky the color of dishwater, rain holding off but threatening. I'd called Brent and Karen the day before, telling them only that I needed help sorting out something at Fenimore's, that it wouldn't take long. Brent had hesitated on the phone a half-second too long, the kind of pause a man makes when a request brushes too close to something he's been trying not to think about before agreeing to come. Karen had simply said she'd be there at 10, already moving on to ask whether I'd started going through the hall closet yet. Curtis Hale arrived first, looking exactly as nervous in person as he'd sounded on the phone, a folder of his own tucked under one arm, his bill of sale, his paperwork, ready to finalize whatever resale he had lined up. He recognized me from our phone call and gave me an apologetic nod, like a man bracing for trouble he hadn't caused. Brent pulled in at 10:05, parking his newer truck at an angle that suggested he hadn't expected to need to stay long. Karen arrived 2 minutes behind him. Neither of them looked at each other the way people do when they're sharing a secret they think is safely behind them. Lou came out of the office wiping his hands on a rag, unhurried, and looked at the 4 of us standing in his bay like a man taking inventory before a job he'd rather not start but wasn't going to put off. "Curtis, I appreciate you being patient on this," Lou said. "Found some things doing the inspection I think the family needs to see before anybody signs anything else on this vehicle." Curtis nodded, clearly relieved to be handed an excuse to step back from whatever was about to happen. Brent's eyes went to me, then to Lou, then to the truck up on the lift behind him. Dorothy's truck, my truck, 20 years of our life parked 4 feet off the ground with its undercarriage exposed like something laid open for an autopsy. "Dad, what's going on?" "I think Lou's going to tell us," I said, and kept my voice as even as I could manage, though my heart was working harder than it had since the funeral. Lou reached into the cab and came out with 2 things. The first was Dorothy's spiral notebook, its blue cover soft with age, rubber band still holding it closed the way she always kept it. The second was a small white envelope, sealed, with my name written across the front in Dorothy's hand, the same careful schoolteacher script that had written grocery lists and Christmas cards, and, "Roy, don't forget Dentist Tuesday for 46 years. This was taped underneath the glove box liner, Lou said, holding up the envelope. "I only found it because I was checking the wiring back there for a rattle the buyer mentioned. Wasn't looking for it, but there it was." Karen's face had gone very still. Brent's hands had found their way into his jacket pockets, the posture of a man trying to look casual while every muscle in his body has gone tight. "Lou," Brent started, "I'm not sure what this is about, but the sale's already done. I've got the cash. The buyer's got the truck." "That's the trouble, son," Lou said, not unkindly, but without any give in it either. "There wasn't a truck to sell, not one that was yours to sell anyway." I took the printed title record from my jacket pocket, the one Beverly had given me 4 days earlier, and handed it to Brent without a word. He read it. I watched his face change as he read it, watched the particular color leave it that happens when a man understands. All at once, that ground he thought was solid has been hollow beneath him the whole time. "Transfer on death," he said quietly. To the VFW post? "Your mother set that up 8 years ago," I said, after my scare with the blood pressure. "I didn't know about it either, Brent. Not until 4 days ago. She never told me, and far as I can tell, she never told anybody but Beverly Atkins, the county clerk, and I looked at Lou. "And me," Lou said. He set the notebook down on the workbench, gentle, like it was something that could still be hurt. "She came to me about 18 months ago. Sat right there." He nodded toward the same plastic chair Curtis Hale had been leaning against and told me straight out she was worried. Said, "Lou, if something happens to me, you watch the truck. Roy won't think to. She wasn't wrong about that, Roy." No offense. None taken, I said, because it was true and because some part of me had known it was true for a long time before today. Karen finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. She knew. About Brent. I think she knew more than any of us gave her credit for, I said. Lou picked up the notebook again, unwound the rubber band with the careful patience of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding, and turned to a page near the back. He didn't read it aloud right away. He looked at me first, a question in his eyes, asking permission. I nodded. There's entries here that aren't mileage, Lou said. Last one's dated about 5 weeks before she passed. He read it, his voice steady, unhurried. Brent asked again about borrowing against the truck, told him no, told him to talk to his father. Honest, for once, before he digs a hole he can't climb out of. The bay went very quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck passed on Route 9, the sound of it rising and fading the way ordinary life kept moving even while 4 people stood frozen around a folder and a fact none of them had been ready for. Brent's jaw worked. He didn't look at any of us. She never told me she knew. She was protecting you the only way she knew how, I said. By making sure that whatever you decided to do, it couldn't actually hurt anybody but yourself. Curtis, I turned to him. You're an innocent man in all this. Lou's going to make sure you get your $4,000 back from Brent, one way or another, and the truck goes where Dorothy intended it to go. I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of a family matter that wasn't yours to carry. Curtis nodded, looking like a man grateful to be excused from a room that had grown far heavier than he'd expected. Karen was crying now, quiet, the kind of crying that comes from a woman realizing the story she'd been telling herself. I'm just being practical. I'm just managing what needs managing. Had a hole in it. She hadn't noticed until somebody else's mother's handwriting pointed it out. I had not raised my voice once. I had not called Brent a thief, though the word had crossed my mind more than once in the last week. I had not told Karen that her urgency to clear out the house had helped create the cover Brent needed to act. The truth was doing what Dorothy always said it would, given enough room and enough patience. It was doing the work itself, in its own time, in front of the people who needed to hear it most, and I found, standing in that bay with my wife's handwriting still hanging in the air, that I didn't need to add anything to it. What happens now? Brent asked, finally looking at me, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw something in his face that wasn't calculation. It looked, instead, like a boy who'd been caught, fully, completely, with nowhere left to hide, and no version of the story that made him look like anything other than what he was. Now, I said, we figure out how you pay Curtis back, and how you pay your debt without selling things that were never yours. And then, son, you and I are going to have the conversation you should have come to me with 3 weeks ago, instead of standing in a parking lot signing my name to something I never agreed to. I picked up Dorothy's notebook from the workbench, held it the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable, and felt, for the first time since I'd stood in that empty gravel lot outside the church, that I finally understood the whole shape of what my wife had built not to punish our children, but to make sure that whatever they chose, the truth would eventually find its way home. The truck went to the VFW post the following month, exactly as Dorothy had arranged it, and I was the one who drove it there myself. Lou helped me get it road ready again. New wiring where the rattle had been, a fresh inspection sticker, the cab cleaned out except for the notebook which I kept, and Dorothy's apron, which had hung on a hook in the cab for years, and which I folded carefully and brought home instead of leaving, for whoever the post would eventually loan it to. Post Commander Hap Reynolds met me in the gravel lot behind the hall, the same kind of gravel lot where this had all started, though this time nothing about it felt like loss. Dorothy never said a word to me about any of this, Hap said, turning the title paperwork over in his hands, shaking his head slowly. 8 years, and she never let on. She wasn't a woman who needed credit for things, I said. Just results. We stood there a while, looking at the truck, and Hap told me they'd keep the raffle tradition going, same as always, October after October, and that this year's program would carry a small note about Dorothy, about the kindness she'd built into something that looked, on the surface, like nothing more than an old farm truck with good tires. Curtis Hale got his $4,000 back, in full within 2 weeks. Brent sold his own newer truck, the one he'd been so proud of, the one he'd parked at an angle in Lou's lot that Saturday morning, like a man who didn't expect to stay long, and used the money to settle what he owed Dale Whitcomb directly, man to man. No more hiding, no more hoping nobody checked the paperwork. It cost him more than the debt itself. It cost him the truck he loved, and some of the easy confidence he'd carried his whole adult life, the confidence of a man who'd never quite had to face the full weight of a thing he'd done. He came to see me 3 weeks after that Saturday at Lou's, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd once overheard him through the hallway saying, "It's handled," in a voice that hadn't accounted for his mother's handwriting waiting in a glove box. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You don't fix a thing like this in one conversation," I told him. "You fix it the way your mother fixed everything that mattered. Slowly, honestly, one true thing at a time, even when it's easier to say nothing." He cried. Then, in a way I hadn't seen him cry since he was a boy. And I let him, because some things a father can't rush past any more than truth can be rushed, and because I understood, finally, sitting there with Dorothy's empty chair beside us, that this too was part of what she'd left me prepared for, not just the legal architecture of a title designation, but the patience to let my son find his own way back to honesty without me dragging him there by the collar. Karen took longer. She didn't cry in front of me the way Brent had. She went quiet instead, in the particular way some people go quiet when they're rebuilding a version of themselves from the inside, brick by brick, without wanting an audience for the work. She still came by on Sundays. She still talked about the house sometimes, though differently now, less about clearing it out fast, more about which of Dorothy's things she might want to keep, which felt to me like its own kind of apology, even though she never said the word out loud. I opened Dorothy's folder, finally, on a quiet evening about a month after the funeral, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. It wasn't dramatic, what I found inside. No grand confession, no secret fortune, nothing that belonged in the kind of story people tell at the diner counter for shock value. Just copies of the title paperwork. A letter to Lou, dated the same week as her visit to his shop, thanking him in advance for something she hoped he'd never have to do. And a single-page address to me, written in the months after my blood pressure scare, that I read 3 times before I could fold it back up. "Roy, if you're reading this, it means I was right to worry, and I'm sorry I'm not there to explain it to you myself. I didn't do this because I thought you couldn't handle things. I did it because I know our children love us, and love isn't always the same thing as patience, and grief makes people reach for whatever feels solid, even when it isn't theirs to reach for. I wanted to make sure that whatever happened, there would be one thing in this family that couldn't be rushed, signed away, or sold out of fear. I love you. Let them finish. The truth doesn't rush. D." I sat with that letter a long while before I put it away. I think about the truck sometimes, out at the post hall, getting loaned out every October to some family hauling hay, or moving a sick relative's furniture across town the way Dorothy intended, the way it had always quietly served people. Long before either of us understood, it would someday serve as proof of something far larger than mileage and oil changes. I think, too, about the morning I stood in that empty gravel lot outside the church. My wife not yet 6 hours in the ground, certain in that moment that I had lost the last thing that still carried her handwriting, her presence, her daily small attention to a life we'd built together for 46 years. I hadn't lost it. I'd only misunderstood, for a little while, what kind of protection it was. Dorothy never tried to control what our children would do after she was gone. She wasn't that kind of woman, and it wasn't that kind of love. She simply made sure that whatever they chose, the truth would have somewhere safe to wait, patient, quiet, written down in a notebook, and a folder, and a single sealed envelope until the day I was finally ready to go looking for it. I keep her notebook on the kitchen counter now, where the recipe box used to sit, and some mornings, before the coffee's even finished brewing, I open it to no particular page and just look at her handwriting for a while. Everything that mattered, she told me once, tapping the glove box with 2 fingers like she was tapping a secret, written down somewhere. People just don't think to look. I think to look now, every single day.